The first thing Dan noticed about the Veth was that they never wasted emotion. He'd watched the feed for 6 hours before he said anything to Roos about it. 6 hours of Veth drones filing in and out of the resource node on Sector 9, each one moving in the exact arc that minimized wind resistance and power draw. No hesitation, no deviation. No two drones ever close enough to risk collision, no gap wide enough to be inefficient. It was like watching water run downhill, except the water was 60 meters tall and could strip a transport down to its component atoms in under 4 minutes. "They're not aggressive," he said finally. Roos looked up from the signal board. She had a stylus tucked behind her ear and grease on her knuckles from where she'd been trying to coax the backup relay into cooperating. "What? The Veth? They're not. They haven't fired on anything. Not since the first week." She thought about that. "Because we stopped going near the nodes." "Right." Dan pulled up a secondary feed, grainy footage from the crawler he'd parked 3 clicks out in the dust field. "But watch this." On the screen, a human supply truck, Petra's Run, the one she took every Tuesday, rolled past the edge of Sector 9's perimeter at a distance of roughly 2 kilometers. A Veth drone peeled off from the column, tracked the truck for exactly 40 seconds, then rejoined the column without incident. "It catalogued her," Dan said. "It's been doing that since she started that route. Every Tuesday, same drone." Roos set down her stylus. "You think they're learning our patterns?" "I think they learned them 3 months ago. I think they're just filing them." He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "They don't need to stop us. We're not going anywhere near the nodes. We're not a threat. We're just data." That was the winter the colonies stopped being afraid of the Veth and started being afraid of something else. The offer came through official channels, which surprised everyone. Dan had expected a drone drop, or a signal interruption, or some other method that felt like a fist. Instead, there was a formal communication packet, translated into 11 human languages, delivered to the colony's main receiver on a Tuesday morning while Petra was doing her supply run, and Roos was trying to fix the same relay she'd been fighting with for 6 weeks. The packet was from a Veth entity that identified itself as the Facilitation Directorate. The translation was precise but slightly strange, the kind of strange you got when something was translated not by a person who understood both languages, but by something that understood the structure of both languages without understanding why anyone would use them. The offer summarized. The Veth had developed a neural synchronization system. It was, they explained, not unlike the human concept of a cochlear implant, except that instead of restoring hearing, it would interface the recipient's cognitive architecture with the Veth processing network. The recipient would retain full individual consciousness. They would simply also have access to the Veth's accumulated data on optimization, efficiency, and resource allocation. In practice, the packet explained, this meant that a synchronized human could do everything they currently did, but better, faster, with fewer errors. The Veth had tested it on 6 volunteer species across 4-star systems. Productivity indices had increased an average of 340%. There was, the packet noted, a 1-month trial period with no binding commitments. "No strings," said Petra, reading over Dan's shoulder. She said it the way you'd say it if you wanted someone to hear how absurd it sounded. 340%, said Yusuf. He was their engineer, and the way he said it was different, careful, like he was trying not to let something show on his face. Dan looked around the table. 5 of them in the operations room, the people he trusted most in the colony. Petra with her arms crossed. Yusuf doing the calculation he always did when he was tempted by something. Roos still holding the relay component she'd been cleaning when the packet arrived. Old Marta from administration, who hadn't said anything yet and whose silence usually meant she'd already made up her mind about something. "We don't even know what it does to you," Dan said. "The packet says it's reversible," Yusuf said. "The packet says a lot of things." Marta set down her coffee mug. "Yusuf, what's our power deficit going into the next quarter?" He didn't hesitate. 31% below minimum operating threshold. if we can't get the backup relay functional before the cold season. We know what happens if we can't, Marta said. She looked at Dan. I'm not saying yes. I'm saying we need to know what we're saying no to. They said no. Then, 6 weeks later, when the relay finally died completely and the cold season hit 2 weeks early, Yusuf said yes. It was subtle at first. Yusuf fixed the relay in 4 hours. A problem that had resisted 6 weeks of Roos's best efforts, solved in 4 hours by Yusuf sitting very still, with his eyes half closed and his hands moving with a precision that didn't look quite like Yusuf's hands. When he was done, he blinked twice and smiled, and said it had been a routing inefficiency in the secondary buffer. Obvious once you knew where to look. He slept 12 hours. When he woke up, he said the sink felt like having a second pair of eyes that never got tired. The colony's power deficit closed. Yusuf redesigned 3 systems simultaneously, all of them better than anything the colony had built before. He ate less. He stopped making the small jokes he'd always made when he was frustrated. The muttered commentary, the complaints turned comic by repetition. He was more efficient. He was less Yusuf. Dan watched. Roos watched too. She told Dan about it at night, quietly, the way you'd report something you weren't sure counted as a problem. He didn't remember my birthday, she said. He used to set 3 reminders. He's busy, he's not busy. He just didn't care. 2 months in, Petra went to the facilitation directorate node and requested a sink for herself. She didn't tell Dan beforehand. She told him afterward over the common room table, and she said it the way people said things when they'd already talked themselves into something, and were now waiting to see if they'd made a mistake. The relay was going to kill us, she said. Yusuf fixed the relay, and now I can fix the next thing, and the thing after that. She looked at her hands. Dan, I feel like I can think in straight lines. Do you know how long it's been since I could think in straight lines without fighting for it? He didn't answer. He didn't know how to say what he was thinking, which was that the straight lines worried him more than the crooked ones. Marta synced in the 3rd month. She came back from the node at midday and sat at her desk and reorganized the colony's entire administrative structure by evening. Dan found her still at her desk at midnight, not because she was struggling, but because stopping hadn't occurred to her. Marta, he said, go to sleep. She looked up. The look lasted a fraction of a second too long, like a calculation. I'll sleep in 4 hours. I'm in the middle of the variance reports. The variance reports can wait. No, she said, and the word was perfectly polite and completely flat. They can't. We've been running a 7% administrative inefficiency in the supply chain allocation for 8 months. It's cost us resources we can't recover. I should have seen it earlier. You did see it, you just had other things to do. That's not an excuse, Marta said. That's a failure mode. He left her there and walked back to his quarters and sat on the edge of his bunk and thought about the way she'd said failure mode and how it didn't sound like the Marta who'd once spent an entire staff meeting arguing that the colony needed to designate 1 afternoon a week for people to sit outside and do nothing because humans needed useless time the way engines needed coolant. The supply depot burned on a Wednesday. They never found out exactly how it happened. A fault in the heating system was the official assessment, but the heating system had been redesigned by Yusuf 3 months ago, and Yusuf's systems didn't develop faults. Dan thought about saying this out loud and then didn't. What he knew was that half their food reserve was gone, and without it the math of the cold season became very bad very quickly. He requested an emergency meeting with the facilitation directorate. He did not tell anyone he was going. He took the old crawler, the manual one, because the newer vehicles had navigation assistance modules that Yusuf had upgraded, and Dan didn't want anyone knowing his route. He drove 3 hours through the dust field with the heat turned low to save power and his jacket zipped to the collar, and he thought about the word efficiency until it stopped meaning anything. What the facilitation directorate had offered was a better version of being human, faster cognition, fewer errors, higher productivity indices, and all of it was real. Dan had watched the numbers, and the numbers didn't lie. The colony was operating at 97% of optimal capacity. 4 people running it who 3 months ago couldn't get above 71. The problem was that 71 had felt like theirs. The node rose out of the dust an hour before sunset, vast and pale against the sky, a shape that the human eye kept trying to resolve into something architectural before giving up. Dan parked at 100 meters and sat in the crawler and looked at it. He thought about Yusuf's hands moving with that not quite Yusuf precision. He thought about Marta and the failure modes. He thought about Petra, who used to sing off-key while she drove her supply route, and who now drove in silence because the singing, she'd explained without embarrassment, introduced unnecessary, cognitive noise. He got out of the crawler and walked to the node. The Veth entity that received him was a configuration of 4 drones that maintained a rough approximation of a single form, not humanoid, not anything else exactly, just present in the space. Across from him, in a way that suggested attention. It communicated through the crawler's translation module, which he'd brought on his belt. He said, "I want to know what you get out of it." The translation took a moment. Then, clarity of your operational patterns. Predictive modeling. The synchronized humans provide data that unsynchronized humans cannot. You're learning us. We are learning to anticipate the parameters of human function and the trial period. The 1-month no-commitment window. Accurate. But you knew that after 1 month the productivity differential would make it functionally impossible to desync. You knew that because you ran this on 6 other species. Another pause. The productivity differential is real. The choice remains with the individual. Dan looked at the drone configuration. He thought about the way it never moved inefficiently, never overlapped, never left a gap. He thought about the Tuesday cataloging of Petra's supply route, 40 seconds of assessment that had happened every week for months before anyone offered anything. The choice remains with the individual, he said. Right. But you designed the offer so that the individual would be choosing between the synchronized version of themselves and the original version, and the synchronized version is measurably, visibly, undeniably better at everything that keeps them alive. He paused. That's not a choice. That's a before and after comparison. Nobody chooses the before. Silence. Not computing silence. Dan had learned to tell the difference. This was something else. No species, the entity said finally, has articulated that framing. The other 6 species. Did any of them ask to desync? The pause was longer this time. 3 did. In each case, the request was withdrawn within 72 hours due to the operational impact of the transition period, and the other 3 did not request desync. Dan nodded slowly. He was cold and tired and a long way from home, and the depot was gone, and he had no leverage and no threat to make. What he had was the specific human capacity for being profoundly inconvenient. I'm pulling my people, he said. All 4 of them, today. The withdrawal period involves significant cognitive disruption. Productivity will fall below pre-sync baselines for an estimated, I know. Tell them anyway. They may choose not to withdraw. Maybe. But they're going to hear it from me first, not from a productivity index. He put the translator back on his belt, and I'm going to be very loud about it. Yusuf cried for 3 days. Not because of the withdrawal. That was its own ordeal. The headaches and the silence where the network had been, and the way simple tasks suddenly felt like dragging something uphill. He cried because he hadn't cried in 4 months, and he hadn't noticed that he'd stopped. And when the grief came back, it came back for everything at once. All the small losses he'd processed efficiently instead of feeling. Roos sat with him. She brought terrible coffee and didn't say anything useful and stayed anyway. Marta did not cry. She got very quiet for 2 weeks, and then one morning she walked into the operations room and said, I think we need to designate 1 afternoon a week for people to sit outside and do nothing, as if no time had passed at all. Petra drove her supply route singing off-key. The singing was worse than Dan remembered, slightly flat on the high notes, and he stood outside the depot and listened to it and felt something loosen in his chest. The colony ran at 68%, then 72, then slowly upward. The Veth continued to operate at optimal efficiency. Their drones moved in perfect arcs through the dust field. Their nodes processed resources with a precision that made the colony's reclaimed chaos look, from a distance, like a system in the early stages of catastrophic failure. From inside, it looked different. From inside, it looked like Yusuf arguing with Roos about the relay again, badly, losing the argument on its merits and winning it anyway through sheer persistence. It looked like Marta's variance reports being 3 days late because she'd spent a Tuesday afternoon outside with her eyes closed. It looked like Petra's singing and Don's stubborn, inefficient, metabolically expensive habit of walking the perimeter at night because something in him needed to see the colony with his own eyes, and not a sensor feed. A new communication packet arrived from the Facilitation Directorate 4 months after the desync. Formal channels again, 11 languages, precise and slightly strange. The packet noted that the colony's operational patterns had become, in their phrase, significantly more difficult to model. It noted that 3 of the 6 other synchronized species had, since the colony's case was entered into the Directorate's predictive database, also requested desync. It requested, in language that was as close to confused as Dan suspected the Veth ever got, an explanatory framework for why a species would voluntarily reduce its own efficiency. Dan drafted the reply himself. He thought about it for 2 days, which was inefficient, and he wrote 3 drafts, which was redundant, and the final version was shorter than the first by half, which meant the first 2 had been necessary. He sent it on a Tuesday morning, while Petra was doing her supply run, singing slightly flat on the high notes, audible from 300 meters away through the operations room wall. The reply said, "We are not trying to be optimal. We are trying to be ourselves. Those are not the same thing, and we have decided that the difference matters." He pressed send. Outside, the Veth drones moved in their perfect arcs. Inside, the coffee was burning and someone had left the relay panel open again, and Marta was 3 days late on a report she'd explain with something human and inadequate and entirely her own. Dan poured the bad coffee and drank it anyway.